It's an unusual thing for me. I'm actually going to give you a polemic. That's a discussion with no real substance at all. Unlike our normal scientific, empirical, evidence-based talks, this one is going to be absolutely superfluous. But it will challenge you to ask some fundamental questions that kind of reflect that 50 years of lifeguarding, 5 decades of teaching, and so on. It's based on the wicked problem. The picture's important. It's particularly important for one Jonathan Webber. Jonathan, put your hand up, mate, just in case people don't know who you are. That is the ex-CEO of WaterSafe Auckland. That is the successor. And for those of you with a business managerial style, this is a key outcome failure. So a part of the built-in performance factor is that. Okay, so we've all understood that drowning is a significant, complex and multifaceted phenomenon. My argument extends a little bit further in my philosophy that I believe that it's all about human interaction with the environment, with the aquatic environment, particularly in our society where most of that interaction actually occurs on a voluntary basis. The wicked problem, in actual fact, was developed by a guy called Horst Rittel, and these were urban planners back in the 70s and 80s who were looking at policy issues which seemed not to go away, issues which constantly kept popping up irrespective of which government, national or local, was in power, irrespective of what form of enterprise was driving society in terms of popular politics and so on. And I thought it was particularly appropriate for drowning and reflecting back on 50 years of being engaged in trying to prevent it, because as some of you might have listened last night, and when I first engaged in lifeguarding, I had a mentality that I was at the bottom of the cliff and I was saving lives, and that all I had to do was promote at the top of the cliff to teach kids to swim, and I'd make myself redundant at the bottom of the cliff. 55 years later, I'm still doing it. I'm still engaged in rescuing people. So in the sense of intervention, I've probably failed at an individual level. So why have I failed? Why is this a persistent problem? It's resistant to solutions. It's multifaceted. It's multi-causal. And quite frankly, for all of us engaged at the top and at the bottom of the cliff, it's a pain in the butt. At a global level, think about things like global warming. There are people who adamantly refuse that there is global warming. There are people who adamantly negotiate that there is global warming. So that's a good example of a wicked problem. The current one, refugees, the enforced movement of migratory populations around the world. No different, particularly from this country, Ireland, which was a major exporter of humankind in the 19th and 20th, early 20th centuries. So what's the difference? It's a wicked problem. So I'm going to give you a couple of characteristics, but I'm going to engage you fellas in some work that'll make you think about your particular definition. In terms of definitions and defining it, it has no specific formulation. There are similarities, and we would argue that the physiological similarities of the process of drowning are relatively evident, although every time I look at one of Mike's box diagrams, I realize that he certainly has defined in scientific terms the complexity of the drowning problem. So he's an ardent and fervent fan of the wicked problem approach. The problem is that there's no rights or wrongs, so there's no right or wrong solution, only good and bad, as you see in a minute. What we're going to do is now apply this general notion of wickedness to drowning. So let's have a look at the difficulty of defining drowning in our little domain, drowning prevention. Compare toddler drowning in rural Bangladesh, which we now know a lot about, and urban Australia. Is it the same problem? Think about pool fencing and fencing a well or a water course in the delta of the Ganges. Think about isolation fences in Los Angeles, Oslo, Auckland, and so on, and compare that with rural Bangladesh. Is it the same problem? Look at the problems we've already confronted in our own time about the protective value of swim, can't swim. We've got no definition still of what it means to be able to, can you swim? We have not answered that question, and we've raised it and we've researched it for the last 10 years, and we're still going strong in it. And all we're doing is creating even more complexity. Think about the dynamics constraint model of Carl Newell, and think about Steve's application of it to a drowning circumstances. It's dynamic, it's interactive, it's not static, it's not linear. Secondly, many interdependencies are multi-causal. Disagreements among stakeholders. In New Zealand, we have what we call the wet sector. That's all of the agencies that are involved in drowning prevention. Surf Life Saving, Coast Guard, Maritime New Zealand, Royal Life, Swims with AS, New Zealand Swim Association, and so on. Multi-dependency, all stakeholders have an independent idea. None of them share the same definition of what either the problem is or the solution. For example, internally conflicting goals, needles, we have illegality of most drug use, apart from coffee and beer, but we provide needle exchange. So is that a contradiction in terms of goal achievement? So let's apply this to drowning. For example, we promote aquatics, swimming, skiing, surfing, water skiing, diving, as healthy aquatic lifestyles. In places like Australia and New Zealand, where opportunity is abundant and the environment is friendly and opportunity abounds, we have this problem that we create greater engagement, therefore we increase risk exposure. So can you see the counterproductivity of it? Think about boating. Then all of a sudden we get recreational leisure time use of boats, which then imply an association with another type of recreational activity, alcohol use. So where it says others, what I'd like you to do in your tables, even this recalcitrant group on my left, have a chat very quickly and come up with one statement that I might point to your table at and give me an example from your view of the world of interdependency, multi-causality. You've got 20 seconds. Off you go. One example of interdependency.
Outside of aquatics.
Shout it out, Shane, sorry.
Outside of aquatics.
No, in aquatics. We've already discussed a number of them in debates this morning.
I'll get one from this morning. Do you want them now?
Yeah. That was 20 seconds.
I was very interested to hear about the Canadian use of life jackets in pools or lakes or whatever. But I wonder what impact that has on developing skills that people would develop without a life jacket. So when they end up in the water without a life jacket, have they got the skills to deal with that setting?
Yep. So everybody clear about that? So you introduce one intervention and it then has ramifications across the board in terms of other things. So if we introduce flotation devices, do we then automatically imply that we don't need swimming skills? That moves us nicely on, thanks Jenny, to the next one. Attempts to solve the problem often lead to unforeseen circumstances. So a good example of that is bike helmets. Hands up if your country has bike helmets laws. Hands up if they don't. Yeah. See, so there's not even equanimity on the importance of bike helmets. Hands up those countries which have speed limits. Hands up those who don't. There are countries in the modern world that have no speed limits. They have open road limits, end of story. Think about things like seat belts. Hands up if you've got seatbelt laws. Almost universally there are seatbelt laws. but not in large parts of the developed world. They don't have seatbelt laws. Think about what happens, and there's a lovely experiment that was done in the mid-United States, not far from you, Steve, where they took all the traffic lights out of a medium-sized town for a month. Took all the traffic lights out. Said, there are no more traffic lights. And then they measured the impact on speed. And the average speed around town, collected over 3 months, was a 13-kilometre-an-hour decrease in speed. So if you increase speed regulation, all right, by controlling lights, roundabouts, and so on, the argument is that it encourages people to speed faster. If you put seatbelts in cars, it encourages you to go faster. If you increase the braking power of cars, it encourages people to go faster. So can you see the contradictions that pop up? And for us in the drowning prevention environment, lifeguards. Hands up, all of us who are lifeguards. Okay? By our very presence, we encourage people to risk exposure. So my beach, Jonathan's beach, which are seriously dangerous beaches, by being there every weekend, I encourage people to risk their lives in seriously high-risk activity in a high-risk environment. And Jenny's point about life jackets. If we encourage everyone to wear life jackets, and we all know that the intrinsic value of wearing life jackets on drowning prevention, does it reduce water competencies? Can you think of others? Are there other things that we can think about? The age-old argument about overconfidence. If we teach our youngsters, the 5-year-olds, to swim, they become overconfident. We have some evidence from Bangladesh that that's not the case. We have very little evidence that we could argue about that in terms of high-income countries. But that's an area of research which I think we should be looking at a great deal. This is probably my favourite. Wicked problems have no clear solutions. Solutions aren't right or wrong. They're only good or bad. Very often they're measured in terms of cost effectiveness in our current managerialist mindset, and they usually are highly resistant to resolution. Most of the things that we think about in drowning have been with us for hundreds of years, and there are a couple of obvious ones. And in spite of our best interest, there are no proven scientific tests to prove the success of an intervention, hence the problem of learn to swim campaigns. How do we actually scientifically measure the outcomes of a learn to swim campaign? Because we don't know which competency saved the kid's life. And that needs further investigation. Application to drowning. Think of the intergenerational problems. We still have 80% of drownings after 90 years of interventions from the middle 20th century, predominantly males. So what have we done in terms of solutions? Have we modified our solutions, educational solutions, to address male problems? Or do we do the same old recipe-driven thing of one size fits all? I say we failed there fairly miserably. And one of the problems that we have in our area is that we thrive on anecdotes and axioms. We've had very little scientific evidence to support the educational impact of drowning prevention measures, and they become remarkably resilient to change. What I've referred to as sedimented practice. It just settles on the bottom of the lake, and it sits there, and it sits there, and it sits there. And even now, where we're trying to implement change in people's mindset towards a more inclusive notion of swimming skill equals water competency, in a much more holistic framework, we have incredible resistance still to that, but we're changing. The problems are often unstable. Look at our drowning statistics. We say there's pretty hard and fast evidence. The drowning rates either increase or decrease. But what actually, and for the large part in high-income countries, our drowning stats are on the decrease. Our rescue stats are on the increase. Our mortality rates are on the decrease, but our morbidity rates are on the increase. For most of us, we don't have stable environments, even climatic. So if we have El Nino conditions or La Nina conditions, it changes the types of people who go to the beach and the frequency of going to the beach. It increases the risk exposure. It increases the risk nature of the environment. More waves, more wind, and so on. So these are unstable. So very often, and yet we've done no correlation, as far as I know, on a longitudinal basis to see what effect weather has on fatalities, morbidities, mortalities, and rescue statistics over time. Perhaps it's time we did that. Think about things that changing in terms of leisure patterns. If we go through an economic slump, more people are out of work, they have less accessibility, less freedom of time, there are usually constraints of travel and so on, and that can affect the drowning rates on a seasonal basis. So are we actually dealing with the same problem on a year-in, year-out basis? So good summer, bad summer, increased, decreased leisure time, increased, decreased access, new settlers, new populations. Is the population you're dealing with the same as it was 10 years ago? In the rockfish study, which we've been going for, rock-based fish study that we've been doing for the last decade, currently in press, hopefully, that showed quite clearly that the populations we deal with are transient. It's not the same people. The levels of acculturation, are they the same from year in to year out? And if you're changing behavior, how long does it take? It's taken us 10 years to effect a fairly substantial change in life jacket use in rock-based fishers in a high-risk area, from 4% to 40%, often always wearing a life jacket. 10 years. That's good going. One of the problems we have is that we don't often have interventions lasting 10 years because of the instability of the funding regimes, and you all know about that. Wicked problems are socially complex. We don't have homogeneity of risk. Some people are at greater risk than others. Children and elderly, fit and unfit, high socioeconomic status, low socioeconomic status, new migrant, resident, tourist, resident. All of these are different populations, and they require different solutions to reduce the drowning risk. They're not only socially complex at a community demographic level, they're incredibly complex, as most of you have battled in advocacy, at a governmental level. When you have to deal with different political wheeler dealers on a monthly, weekly, daily basis, as some of us do, it is very, very complex and very, very difficult because, going back to point 5, it's an unstable environment. And if politics is not an unstable environment, I don't know what is. So there's some of the things: young, old, supervised, unsupervised. Young, old, male, female, high risk, low risk. And this one probably sits because most of you represent organizations rather than individuals. The problem doesn't reside conveniently with any one organization. Hands up, how many of you know what the Ottawa Charter is? The Ottawa Charter. Yeah. The Ottawa Charter is a public health model of collaboration. It's now in its 29th year, and most of you know nothing about it. And most of you are in medical and public health fields or education. And the whole purpose of the Ottawa Charter was to say exactly that. The problem doesn't exist and sit conveniently with one organization, and the only way to tackle it is to deal in a collaborative, cooperative, conjoint mode. And yet I don't know what it's like in your countries, but I can say unequivocally, after 4 decades of battling in advocacy in New Zealand, that we have not solved or got anywhere near solving that problem, in spite of the rhetoric of many of the organizations, including my own. oh, I'm in trouble. So it requires action at different levels. Back to the complexity problem. Individual, group, local, international, private, public. And we have all sorts of different models. The American model is quite different from the Australian model, which is quite different from the English model, and certainly different from the Irish model, which I've got no idea about. Sorry, John. The problem of it not sitting conveniently is that if you've got this competition, one of the problems is that we compete for the same contestable funding. So there's a limited pot of dosh, and we're all applying for that money. And so it often is not done on an evidence-based need, but on a who you are and what you know at a political level, which pulls the purse strings. And in the 40-odd years that I've been involved with it in New Zealand, nothing's changed. The problem still exists. This one, probably, John, you were most able to speak on, that it involves behaviour change. And this may be the most difficult characteristic because, as I've just alluded to, it's taken us 10 long years of active on-field intervention to get a change out of a pretty reticent bunch of hard-nosed Kiwi fishermen. We use social levers. We've got legislation. By and large, that fails. We got fines, very popular in the States, wouldn't go anywhere near being a success in Australia, which is a convict nation, or in New Zealand, which is a bunch of farmers and they don't believe anything. Taxes, peer pressure, public approbation, and so on. So there's all sorts of media pressure, and now we've got social media pressure. All of those things can affect behaviour change, but it's constantly changing dynamic. I mean, 10 years ago, what was social media? I still don't know what Facebook is. Think about some of the things that we do in our drowning prevention circle. Compulsory voluntary life jackets. Hands up those of you who have compulsory life jacket use in recreational use in your country. Compulsory life jacket use. Hands up those of you who have voluntary life jacket use. Hands up those who have carriage of life jacket use. So you see, we can't even agree at a governmental level about the evidence-based proof of the value of life jackets. It's a wicked problem. Bylaws. I was just telling Linda, sadly, that we've had very great deal of success in fencing of swimming pools. We had an act brought out in 1987, following on closely from the Brisbane experience, the Queensland experience, and virtually eliminated toddler drowning. Virtually eliminated. Our government now, right-wing government, needless to say, I'm not showing my political colours here, but are now about to repeal the Fencing of Swimming Pools Act, under political lobbying from the Building Association, the Swimming Pool and Spa Pool Association, and a whole pile of other entrepreneurs who don't want to spoil their infinity pool with a bloody great big fence. That's what it boils down to. The reality is, as a good friend of mine, a head of ED in Starship Children's Hospital said, children will die, and you politicians will need to keep your eyes firmly fixed on the parents when you explain the change in law that you're about to bring in. And that was, to me, one of the most profound statements of the drowning problem and its complexity that I've heard in the last couple of years. Social marketing, can we work that? Knowledge, attitudes and behaviours, can we change knowledge? Is there a given that enhancing knowledge enhances attitudes and therefore influences behaviours? There are some of us who don't believe that. Some will say that that doesn't happen, that's idealistic, unrealistic. You're better off fining them or imprisoning them or building up a big wall. Characterised by chronic policy failure. I say again, think about some of the enduring aspects of our society like poverty. For most of you sitting in this room, the poverty gap in your country is getting wider by the minute. So, racial prejudice, is it getting better? So we've got these problems which are wicked. We've tried solutions. We've tried all sorts of legal, educational practices, but we haven't resolved them. And that's where I use that term of sedimentation, that these things just settle and they become the social norm. So in terms of chronic policy failures, what happens in drowning? We have water safety strategies. We've got a new one now in New Zealand from 2016. The one from 2005 to 2015 sunk without a trace. I know, I was on it. I was a part of the council for implementing that program. How many of you folk have got national water safety strategies? How many of you think they work? How many of you listen to the grand rhetoric of politicians when they rubber stamp them? They don't fund them, they don't finance them, they don't resource them, but they rubber stamp them. Drowning prevention within organisations. Look at our international wet sector. Have we succeeded? About the only thing I think that we've succeeded with at an international level, and hopefully some of the golden oldies will agree, we've managed to define drowning. That took, 30 years? And we've only just managed to agree what that is, let alone drowning prevention. So you can see that defining swimming and water comps is going to be an ongoing battle, which you young ones are going to have to sort out. I've had enough. Finally, every wicked problem is novel and unique. In spite of similarities, we could say that when people drown, they drown. It doesn't matter whether it's Bangladesh or New Zealand, that they have similar characteristics, but they defy common solutions. So what works in terms of educational inventions in England may not apply in Vietnam. What works in Iceland may not apply in Botswana. What I think we generally tend to do is have a one-size-fits-all mentality. I call it recipe-driven education. Doesn't work. It doesn't work. And that's one of the problems, I'm afraid, with award schemes, which put assessment as the a priori desperate need for all. It's not. Don't let the assessment cart drive the horse, because unfortunately, one size does not fit all. There are no set rules, which makes it difficult to quantify and legislate against. On the way to New Zealand 2 days ago, and I think it was Ron. Ron, you held up a newspaper, mate. I'm going to have to leave the television. Keep talking amongst yourself. Deadly silence. This is the director's cut, by the way. Okay. Back to screen. No, right out of it. Keep going left. I want you to give me a reason. Keep going back. I want you to give me a reason. 12 people drowned in this headlines in the Sunday Express, a wonderful paper. Slightly left of Genghis Khan. Basically, it was talking about 12 drownings, and several people from England have alluded to it in the last 2 weeks. So we've been 12 people drowned. Can we very quickly give me 10 reasons around the room? Why? Not how. Why? So can we pick Keith 1, 2, Toril 3, Harvey 4, Lois 5, Jonathan, you can be 6. Sorry, I don't know your name. 7, got 8. Finish off on this table, 9, 10. Very quickly, those 10 people. Why did you drown, Kwan?
I didn't know how to swim.
I didn't know how to swim. Why did you drown, Shane?
I underestimated the conditions.
You underestimated the risk. Yeah? Yeah. Okay. Torrell, why did you drown? You overestimated your ability. Who was next? Hafi, why did you drown?
Probably too much current and nothing you could do about it. It was not a question of underestimating, or it was sudden, something that so suddenly.
Natural causes. Louis, why did you drown? You had a heart attack. Jonathan, why did you drown? You didn't know about tides. All right. Colin, why did you drown?
I knew that alcohol was less deadly than
You got drunk. Okay. Why did you drown?
I didn't know the depth of the water.
Didn't know the water. Why did you drown?
Somebody said it was safe to go in.
Somebody said it was safe to go in. You're all wrong. The reason you drowned was the cuts led to drownings. Because there was underfunding of one of the life-saving organizations, those 12 people drowned. So can you see how that is a wicked problem? This is the front page of the largest circulating newspaper in the United Kingdom. And it was last Sunday, 2 days ago. And if you read on through it, it will actually give you about 20 reasons why people drown. All of them vacuous. People don't drown because of funding cuts. And yet we in organizations constantly use that threat. If you don't do this, 27 people are going to drown next week. And yet if we view the problem as a wicked problem, we'll recognize the futility of that. So in conclusion, have I got any answers? And the short answer is no. I'm inclined to think that the best way to solve it is to get Tipton to do one of his flow diagrams, all right, with 500 boxes on it, and then simply give everybody a laser light and take Tipton's boxes to pieces and hit down. Because every time he does that, I've noticed over the years, I think, I know which one he's going to hit. I know which one he's going to hit. Next minute, it's the wrong box that he hits. I've never been right, Mike, in all the years I've watched him. So it does underlie, without jest, the complexity of the drowning problem. And I've learned the hard way over all those years that I'm not going to solve it either alone or in my lifetime. And that if I view it as a wicked problem, at least I get some resolution that at some stage, you're going to have to step out, and you young ones are going to have to pick up that wicked problem. Thanks very much.